So thank you so much to everyone for being here. Very sincerely, we're having a very important conversation today about justice in fashion and human trafficking and modern slavery in the fashion, luxury, and retail sectors. So before we actually get started with the event, I did want to do a land recognition. So my name is Timothy Parent, and I'm hosting this event from the occupied territory of the Duwamish, better known as the city of Seattle. And I want to acknowledge this unceded land that I'm currently occupying in order to help decolonize our gathering spaces, recognize Indigenous stewardship of the land, air, and water we claim as our own, and to combat the invisibility and erasure of Indigenous peoples. So I would like to invite you all to find out whose land you're currently occupying by visiting native-land.ca. Don't worry, I'll send that in the chat. And to incorporate a land acknowledgement whenever you're speaking to a group. And if you already know whose territory you are currently occupying, please feel free to share it in the chat. And I'd like to invite Marie to introduce herself as well.
Thank you very much, Timothy. So I am Marie Wattier, and I'm really glad to be here today. I did my own research, and I'm joining you from the occupied territory of the Piscataway and the action.Thank, better known as Washington, D.C.
Thank you for acknowledging the land, and I've shared the link in the chat box. So if you guys want to go and look up whose land you're currently occupying, I think it's really important to have that knowledge and to share it with others. So I'd like to introduce myself and Harvard Alumni for Fashion, Luxury, and Retail for anybody that may not know me or the organization. My name is Timothy Parent, and I graduated from Harvard College in 2009 with a degree in East Asian Studies. And when I was studying China, I was told that it's impossible to know everything about China, which shattered my perception of history as immutable, irrefutable, singular, objective, and knowable. And I think we're going to run into some of these similar issues while discussing human trafficking and modern slavery today. So my thesis, I wrote it about the difference between clothing, fashion, and style and how these concepts manifest in China. And I then spent 10 years there in Shanghai doing field research. So right before I moved back to the States, I started this group in 2019. And we are currently a global organization that includes 600 people, 600 Harvard alumni on 6 different continents, spanning 8 different decades from the 1950s to the 2020s, and 13 different schools at Harvard. So we actually cover all 13 schools, and we're incredibly proud of our global and diverse network. And these individuals are able to join events such as these, and they're also able to join subcommittees, which are smaller communities based around more specific areas of interest, including technology, entrepreneurship, e-commerce, architecture, and design. We have 22 such subcommittees. And we really became an organization for the expressed purposes of networking, education, and charity. So our programming is formed around 6 core areas of interest, or 6 main themes: networking, education, DEIB, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, sustainability, technology, and creativity. So we believe that this conversation today really addresses education and DEIB. And we really want to just use this platform to have missing conversations in the fashion, luxury, and retail spaces. And I do want to also mention that tomorrow is Human Trafficking Awareness Day. So we really hope that you can take some information that you learned today and share it with your professional and social networks so that we can really bring awareness to this critical issue. And Marie, would you like to give us a little bit more information about yourself and justice in fashion?
Sure. So, well, I worked in the textile industry and circular fashion in Europe before joining Justice in Fashion last year. As Timothy pointed out in the invitation, Justice in Fashion is a fairly new organization that was founded in March 2020 when the COVID-19 froze our globalized economies. So you probably know, in March last year, fashion brands and retailers started canceling orders that were placed the year before and that were sometimes already finished and shipped and in the warehouses. As of today, there is $16 billion in debt that hasn't been paid for, and $2 billion of which is owed for garments workers' wages. So, well, to put it more concretely, that means workers went jobless, hungry, and destitute. Justice in Fashion was formed to raise awareness on these issues and to collaborate with all the stakeholders out there to take action. Our ethos is to educate, engage, and empower, and I believe we're here to do that today.
Amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your information in the chat box, everyone. Please feel free to use and utilize that. We have a great turnout today on a Sunday of 73 people, and I would really love for you to be able to connect with one another, because we do need to take collective, organized action in order to kind of address these issues. So as I mentioned, tomorrow's Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and you can use these two hashtags, Who Made My Clothes or Justice in Fashion, when you're creating these posts. And so before we really get into the meat of the conversation, I'd really like to work on or really define the terms, modern slavery and human trafficking. So if anybody wants to put into the chat, what do you think modern slavery is, or what does it entail? So we'll give you about 1 minute to do that. I also wanted to recognize Harvard Alumni for Global Development and Harvard Alumni for Global Development and Harvard Global We, or Harvard Global Women's Empowerment, for their support in this event as well, and welcome any of those members that are joining us today. And Yashi also shared another great hashtag, Fashion Revolution. So Jennifer, thank you for your comment. She said human exploitation is for profit, which is certainly accurate. So modern slavery, for the definition, I'd like to ask Marie to give us a more concrete definition.
Modern slavery is defined as the severe exploitation of other people for personal or commercial gain. So yeah, Jennifer, you were right. Modern slavery is all around us. It's often out of sight. So people can become entrapped making out clothes, serving out food, picking crops, or working in factories, but also working in houses as cooks, cleaners, and nannies. And modern forms of slavery includes debt bondage, where a person is forced to work for free to pay off a debt, but also child slavery, forced marriage, and domestic servitude. And there's also, of course, forced labor, where victims are made to work through violence and intimidation. The Global Slavery Index estimated that roughly 4.3 million individuals are currently caught in modern slavery, with 71% of this being female and 1 out of 4 being children.
Those are shocking numbers. It's an estimate, a rough estimate, of 40.3 million people around the world currently caught in modern slavery. But this is largely issues that affect women, as 71% of those are female, as Marie pointed out. So assuming a population of 7.6 billion people, and using that figure of 40.3 million, 1 in 200 people is considered a modern slave. It's actually 1 in 188 or 189. So it's a shockingly high number, and something that we do need to address. So you guys can go ahead and also take a minute to try and define human trafficking, like what it is or what it entails. So we'll give you a little bit of time in the chat, and I'm going to catch up on some of the great comments that are coming through. Sharon said, yes, living under threat. Yashi, very good point, no freedom for forming unions. We're seeing a lot of that happen in our technology sector and in the fourth industrial revolution. Great, thank you guys so much for your comments and being so active and educated on this issue. And we of course invite anyone at any time to share any information that they have with us, because we're not professing to be experts. As I said, it is hard to know a lot of these facts or information because it is so out of sight, as Marie mentioned. But Marie, can you define human trafficking for us?
So the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime defined it as, well, 3 things. So there's first the acts. It can be recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and receipt of persons. So it doesn't, we often think that it would be moving people from one place to another, but actually trafficking only needs people to be recruited. And then there is the means, so threat, or as Shan mentioned, or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits to a person in control of the victim. So usually it would be the parents. And finally, there's the purpose. And this purpose is exploitation. Exploitation as, well, exploiting the prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, and similar practices, and also the removal of organs.
There are around 430 million people around the world that work in fashion and textile production, and 80% of those people are women. So again, this is an issue that disproportionately affects females. And the undocumented nature of many exploited peoples means that much of this goes unreported. So some of the reasons why not everything is reported and it's hard for us to get good facts on this is because people fear losing their one job, even if it is forced labor, fear of being deported if they're undocumented, and a lot of people are victimized through their status, their immigration status. And then there's also the fear of shame and further victimization. And so some of these, but fortunately, some of these victims manage to break free from exploitation and share their stories, which is one of the main reasons why we know that these issues exist. So I'd like to ask Marie to share one such story.
This is the story of Jenny. Both Jenny's parents were tailors, and she grew up surrounded by sewing machines and learned how to sew early on in her life. Later on, when she became a mother, she left Indonesia to work as a seamstress abroad so she could provide for her son and earn a better living. So she left Indonesia when her son was 2 weeks old, and abroad she started working in a factory where there was no decent lighting and no toilet paper in the bathrooms. She was paid $125 per week, which is 500 a month. And I'd like to ask you, where do you think this story takes place?
We really do, we want people to know where this is happening. And I did see, while everybody is sharing their guesses in the chat, I'd like to highlight a comment by Jennifer. She said, forced labor, not sex trafficking, actually accounts for most of the modern slavery in the world, and it's embedded into our global economy, which is absolutely correct, and we will touch on soon. So, so you can kind of share your guesses, but Marie, where did this happen?
Good guess, everyone. So yeah, this story takes place in the USA. It was part of the documentary made by Remake World called Made in America. It actually takes place in Los Angeles, and that was not so long ago, even though now Jenny works in decent conditions and earns a living wage, many women in Los Angeles still experience what she used to go through. To give you a rough estimate, we think 50,000 garment workers work in LA, and mostly immigrant women. 85% of the factories in LA are in violation, which
is shockingly high, right? So even made in America doesn't mean that we can, escape these issues of human trafficking and modern slavery. One of the reasons why she was paid a lower wage was because she couldn't communicate. One of the reasons why was because she wasn't allowed to, but also language barrier means that immigrants are generally paid less and people of color are paid less, or it's an excuse to pay them less, as well as their status. And we also think of a lot of these people, immigrants, as unskilled workers or unskilled laborers, but they're actually incredibly skilled. In Jenny's case, both of her parents were tailors, and she was surrounded by this trade and was probably very skilled at her job. Another issue that is also kind of looking into the future is that we will have technological advances within the industry which threaten to replace the livelihoods of so many people and so many women. And another issue that I'd like to kind of highlight is that there's a human cost that is not only the victim themselves. Jenny left her 2-week-old son, which I don't know how many people could do that, but she was very brave and selfless, I believe, in doing this because she believed that she could make a better life for not only herself, but also her family and her child. And unfortunately, because of greed, she really, $500 in LA, I don't think there's much left to save, given the cost of living. So there are about 200,000 garment workers in the US, and it's difficult to find the exact number because many are undeclared. And there were 11,500 cases of human trafficking reported to the human trafficking hotline last year in the US. But again, many of these cases go unreported. So we would like to ask everyone now where you think most human trafficking or modern slavery takes place, or alternatively, Marie and I were trying to figure out where it doesn't happen, if there are any countries or places where it does not happen. Thank you everyone so much for your comments. I just wanted to note to A. Packard, you're still messaging me privately, so if you want to share any of your great comments with the group, make sure that you're sending to everyone. So Marie, can you let us know where most human trafficking or modern slavery takes place, or where maybe the least of it takes place?
Well, I would say the least of it take place, well, regarding the fashion industry in deindustrialized or non-manufacturing countries that are less likely to be found guilty of perpetrating human trafficking and modern slavery on their land. However, all the countries all over the world are involved in this, since even the countries where it doesn't happen so much. And I'm not talking about forced labor, because there is forced labor and sex trafficking and modern slavery everywhere, but we heavily import clothing that is tainted by modern slavery and human trafficking.
Yeah, so even if, as you mentioned, 85% of the factories in LA are kind of are participating in these systems and perpetuating them. But even if we're importing clothes, a lot of those at some point have been tainted by modern slavery and human trafficking, right? So the US imports most of the textile goods that Americans consume, so $110 billion versus $25 billion exported. And at some point along the supply chain, unfortunately, almost all of these goods are tainted by these terrible issues. so one of the reasons why this happens is because of extremely long supply chains, and often what happens with large orders is a lot of subcontracting. There's also unemployed workers and undocumented workers, which are easier to victimize. And so it's really hard to get an exact figure, but we really have these supply chains because so much of retail is based on price. So modern slavery and human trafficking are a multi-billion-dollar industry with just forced labor aspect alone generating 150 billion US dollars per year. So as Jennifer mentioned in the chat, this is really inextricable from the global economy. But we hope to, you know, kind of separate our economy with these abhorrent practices. So Marie, would you like to share the story of Paramu?
Sure. So this is the story of Paramu. Paramu lives in Tamil Nadu in India. So Tamil Nadu is a southern region of India where it's called the textile hub of India. And she was sent to work at the spinning mill when she was 11 years old. She explains that she earns 200 rupees per day, which is $2.80. And she works from 6 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. She would like to go to school, of course, and school in India is mandatory from the age of 6 to 14, and it's free. But she's not sure her parents would be able to let her go and stop working because they need the money to be able to survive.
Yeah, so we wanted to ask everyone what they believed the root cause of this person's victimization was, but Jennifer already shared it, and it's capitalism, and late stage capitalism. I actually don't believe we're that late in capitalism, but we're already having K-shaped recoveries, and it's really a split between the have and have-nots. But there's also a cultural demand for products to be cheap. And this is not to place the blame on individual consumers themselves. Brands have been incredibly effective at offloading their guilt and their responsibility to end consumers. We can see this in the environmental movement of, you know, BP coming up with something like a personal carbon footprint. I'm sure that brands will try to find clever ways, or already probably have found clever ways, to try and make us feel like we're responsible for knowing and then avoiding these products, which to a degree we absolutely are. And we need consumers to help push brands to do the right thing, because brands are motivated by profit. That's pretty much the sole reason that they operate, and they don't account for human or environmental costs. So there's a human cost to this story, and we have to look at her opportunity cost, Parva's opportunity cost. Everything is based on money. So she makes $2.80 per day, and that's $1,022 per year. So if she could somehow directly get a little bit over $1,000 in 1 year, she would not. She would have the opportunity to get an education, which is also one of our core missions, and that will be the way that we address a lot of the world's issues. Cheap products in particular are often made with this type of labor condition, but it isn't only cheap products that exploit systems of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. So Marie, is price a good indicator of modern slavery?
Well, most of the time it is, and as people said, it's really a race to the bottom. People in the chat, thank you for commenting, everyone. In sourcing, we indeed seek the cheapest costs and prices, but it's not a good indicator. It's not always a good indicator because, well, I'm going to tell you the story of Czech. Czech is a Senegalese worker, and it worked in Italy for Thermoplaque, which is a subcontractor of one of LVMH Italian leather suppliers called Sabri. And he worked in dreadful conditions, 13 hours per day. Well, to give you some really horrid details, they were not allowed to go to the bathrooms and were told to go behind the machines if need be. And he was no legal worker, so when he showed up to receive his salary, he was told by the factory manager to go such places at some point in the day, and he was beaten up instead. He went to the police and reported this, but he never heard back from them and was left destitute without a pay and without another job. So
this person worked for a supplier for LVMH, correct?
yes, well, in the end, so that was at one of the early stages of the supply chain, when it's not the nice part of the leather manufacturing. It's when it really, well, it smells of rotten eggs in the factories, and the lighting is really bad, and
it also smells of urine in this particular factory because they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom.
Exactly. Well, there are actually 30 steps from slaughtering the cow to the bag, and this is one of these earlier stages. So it doesn't need to be reported. And the thing with subcontracting, as you said, it's often because of large orders that the manufacturer take, even though they know they can't do that by the time they are asked to do it. And in this case, it was an undeclared subcontractor. And when you ask, so these handbags were going to Kenzo in the end. And when you ask Kenzo, do they know anything about this? They would tell you this is not in our books, and there is no traceability on this, no transparency.
Yeah, transparency is incredibly important, right? So, you know, as technology moves us forward, hopefully we'll be able to leverage technologies to bring solutions to these issues. So blockchain could potentially be a solution for creating more transparency in fashion supply chains and luxury supply chains, because as we know that this issue isn't only endemic to cheap products or fast fashion brands. It's also affected, you know, mid-range and luxury products. I do have to say that I'm friends with Carol and Umberto, and they would never, ever, ever use forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking. But I do believe that, you know, sometimes people with the best intentions do fall victim to these systems of victimization. And this is not to excuse them or LVMH in any way, but we have to realize that, you know, even if we are personally against this and we're working in the industry, we could at some point have, you know, help to perpetuate this system. So we do need to definitely increase transparency. LVMH is working really hard on sustainability, and they do have a strict code of conduct, but you know, they can also fail to acknowledge malpractices within their own supply chain. So we'd like to ask the chat, what is one brand that you think uses modern slavery in their supply chain? Or what is one brand that it's probably better to share something that you know, but again, we may not be able to know everything. So are there any examples of brands, J. Crew, ? Zara? Yeah, definitely Primark. Definitely all the fast fashion brands. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of the people that, you know, the C-suite executives, the CEOs, a lot of them are men, and white, cisgender, heterosexual men, which nothing against those people if they're doing the right thing. But if they're willingly and knowingly perpetuating these systems of victimization, I think we need to excoriate these brands and hold them really accountable. So Jennifer said, no brands use modern slavery intentionally. Codes of conduct are just words. It is a complex supply chain, and there is no incentive legally for brands to find out what is going on in them. So we will be touching on the legalities soon. But we do want to touch on a couple of brands and instances that we know of. So Marie, could you share some of those?
Sure. Well, Sharon mentioned Boohoo, and yes, I want to come back to Leicester. So you might know that Boohoo is a giant in the retail industry, in the textile industry, and they are manufacturing some of the goods in Leicester in England. It's been reported for some years now that workers were paid as low as £3.5 per hour, and that also happened during the pandemic. Well, Boohoo is the owner of Nastigal and Pretty Little Thing, so they're online retail, and they have also, well, paid dividends to their shareholders repeatedly.
And sorry to interrupt you, but the fact that people are making £3.5 per hour and compounded with the health risks of the global pandemic, I think makes this not only an extremely current issue, but even more abhorrent and reprehensible, because people are risking their lives because they don't have any other choice. Please go ahead and continue with other examples, Marie.
Well, if we want to, so because I've seen that in the chat, people were asking about, well, Jennifer was saying there is no incentive legally. We've always been called by the parliament to report on these issues and to tell people what they were doing on this. So this is also something that needs to be tackled. There are in the US and in the UK, there are laws to safeguard workers, but they are not being implemented because laws exist, but there is no punishment attached to them. We are supposed to be able, well, for instance, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK requires business making more than £36 million per year to publish a statement of their describing the steps taken in the supply chain to ensure that there is no slavery or human trafficking occurring at any point. The problem with this law, it can't be enforced. It is said to be toothless, and this is one of the main issues there.
Yeah, Sharon shared with us that it legally becomes more complicated the further you go back in the supply chain. So Alice asked, what does everyone think of H&M's latest initiatives, Treadler and Singular Society? We'll open up for, we will open up the Q&A session at the end. So we're almost through it and we'd love everyone's participation. And so I did want to, we're not here to shame brands in the same way that we're not here to shame consumers into action, but we did want to point out a mid-tier luxury label or an accessible luxury label, Hugo Boss, that held women against their will and they couldn't leave the premises, which to me, that's not the way a job actually functions, but holding people against their will or giving them, like housing within a factory is a controversial subject. And I spent 10 years in China, and I'm sure many of you have heard about the systemic cultural erasure and even genocide that's happening in Xinjiang's in China's western region of Xinjiang. And so there is also evidence that the million Uyghurs that have been forced into, that are basically forced into working, some of these things include picking cotton or processing cotton, but it also includes producing technology and electronics. So one of the worst cases, because, you know, often you'll see if you go to Hugo Boss that they have their code of conduct or a statement against modern slavery, but as Sharon mentioned, they're just words. But we actually have the case with Apple that they're actively fighting against legislation to enforce these issues. So companies do have a vested interest in basically fighting against the change. So there is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was introduced in the US. And it would require US companies to guarantee they do not use imprisoned or coerced work from the predominantly Muslim region of Xinjiang. And so Apple is basically trying to make it impossible to enforce, and this isn't trying to clean up their entire supply chain. This is just one instance, and it's intertwined, and it intersects with genocide, and cultural erasure. So this issue isn't only specifically about modern slavery and human trafficking, but it goes much deeper and much darker. So the motivation of profit is extremely powerful. And even though, you know, Tim Cook, I'm sure he's a good person, but there are many stakeholders in these companies, and money definitely does corrupt the system and make it hard to change, but that's also a tool to help us to change these systems. So, you know, we can hit brands where it hurts, which is their bottom line. We would like to give people some information on how you all can help take action. So the first step is to educate yourself and others. So some of you are more educated than we are, know much more about this subject than we do, but, you know, even if this is your first time hearing about it, you've already taken the first step and the first action necessary to addressing this issue. We can listen to witnesses, victims, and survivors. There are multiple documentaries like Made in America and The True Cost. There are also reports and books such as A Harvest of Thorns. And then once you have this knowledge, it's really important to share it with others. It might be seen as an unsavory topic, but I guarantee you the lived experience is way more difficult than having a conversation with someone about it. And I'm extremely fortunate and blessed to not know anything of, you know, like to not have any lived experience of this issue. But education allows us, you know, that first step to understanding and being compassionate and ultimately trying to empathize with people that are in these kind of situations. So Marie, what are some other ways that people can take action?
You can definitely engage, and I really appreciate you all commenting here because this is what you're doing, but we need to speak with social workers and human rights advocates and listen to what everyone has to say on these issues. And if you can also volunteer your own time to support this organization and individuals. It's also important we ask brands what steps they are taking to tackle these issues. We need to hold them accountable and ask, for instance, who made my clothes, or ask them specific questions about such and such products. It's also a good thing to sign petitions. I don't think they're some of them are, but some of them are not so effective in terms of results, but they are always effective in terms of awareness.
Even if you're like a small, you know, even if you don't have a huge following, it's really important that like everyone, you know, we share this information with everyone. And also I would like to ask anyone that can to donate to organizations such as Justice in Fashion. It's a new organization, it's a wonderful organization, and it's really having conversations and doing the research around this critical issue that a lot of people in the fashion industry are just scared to even touch or talk about. Because again, kind of everyone is implicated in this system, and we have to acknowledge our own complicity in the system and our own benefit from the system and our cost savings, and actively work against that. So, so there are some other ways, Marie, to facilitate change.
Yes, well, there is also one that seems tricky. So it's up to the last step. It's identifying and reporting forced labor and domestic servitude when you face it. And well, that can be difficult, but well, as I said before, slave labor can be, or human trafficking can be the people, the nannies or the cooks or the cleaners or some people we see every day. So if we can, it's important to report what we see.
And when we all do get back to traveling as normal, I have seen in some airports, you know, signs that tell people how to identify victims of human trafficking. So, you know, maybe that would be a more appropriate context because, you know, they move around in similar ways that we do, right? Sometimes they may be sitting a few rows behind us on a flight, which is hard to think about, but you have to, I mean, one of the facts we talked about is that 1 in 200 or 1 in 188 people around the world globally is a victim of modern slavery. So sorry to cut you off. Go ahead, Marie.
No, you're fine. Well, you can also, of course, invest in companies with strong ethics and engagements, which is a kind of reward to those brands that have strong commitments against forced labor and modern slavery.
And we'll have a lot of brands currently that are having statements about environmentalism. A lot of it's greenwashing. So we do need to look for what's sincere, but maybe, you know, part of the next movement or part of these paradigm shifts that the fashion system has to undergo in order to survive, we have to make sure that this is one piece of the puzzle that is addressed.
Yes. Well, if you want to invest in companies that you really think or you're sure of strong ethics, it's always easier when there are shorter supply chains. Mm-hmm. If there are local artisans or manufacturers, and if you can really go up to, well, the first stage really of the supply chain, then I would encourage you to invest in them. And that goes also with buying differently, buying handmade products, buying from companies that produces completely in-house or have shorter and transparent supply chains. And yeah, also, this is also really important. Look out for the countries of origin. It doesn't state where the fibers are from, but it's always a good indicator of what could happen and of the length of the supply chain. And
we did talk on, you know, the price point being an indicator or not. The point was not that a low price point doesn't indicate. Usually a really low price point, like the 6p, 6 pence, you know, that Boohoo is selling clothes for, that is an indicator of modern slavery and human trafficking within the supply chain.
Oh, they would tell you it was loss lead and it was something it was only a marketing strategy. But yes, I agree. Like if the price is low, it's really likely to be made in poor conditions. But if it's high, it doesn't mean it's done in proper conditions.
So Timothy, just as a note, you know, if you could, knowing from who I am in the past and what I've been writing, you know, I'm in apparel manufacturing, and just to let you know that any products you import into the US for apparel, if there's any cotton in it, the chance is 90% the cotton has come from the Xinjiang region of Northwest China, just to let you know. And that's the huge challenge we have in sourcing. And you know, as a director of corporate social responsibility for my company, the transparency is very difficult. So we know that, for example, we manufacture for universities in the country. We have the license to all the universities. There will be a language provided in the licensing contracts by universities about cotton in that region, probably in the latter part of 2021 and into 2022. So that's just, one license.
Yeah, do you mind if we're gonna wrap up within like the next 5 minutes or so, and then we would love to hear the rest of that, because Nathan is talking about a very important issue, which is it's a very modern, it's a documented issue. We know that there are people that have been held against their will, it's forced labor, and it is cultural erasure and genocide. And we, unfortunately, I would never want to give any of my money to something that perpetuated a system like that. But unfortunately, we're falling victim to systems of victimization, and as educated and conscientious consumers and also professionals, we need to force this change. So one of the things we can do is boycott brands. That's the opposite strategy, that's hitting them where it hurts. Especially brands that know what's happening and refuse to act, like Apple. They're not only refusing to act, they're actually fighting against enforcement of a law that would affect their supply chain, in my opinion, in a positive way. So you can also just not buy things at all. There's, Greta Thunberg is into Stop Shop. It's also environmental. Yeah, we want to ensure that we're not creating more demand for products. And someone that I recently spoke to coined the term stuffication. So we're suffocating just from stuff, right? And we don't necessarily need more of it. So just the main takeaways from our conversation, and I'd love to open it up because you guys all seem so engaged and knowledgeable and like wonderful people. So a lot of this human trafficking and modern slavery is really at the root of it is capitalism and the profit motive. And this blight on the fashion industry, like fashion, luxury, and retail industries, disproportionately affects the most vulnerable communities. Among them, people of color, women, and children. And it doesn't happen in faraway countries. This is happening in the US and the UK. It's happening pretty much in every country. Marie and I were not really able to find a country that where it didn't happen. So Marie, would you like to share a couple of takeaways?
Sure. Well, I wanted to know, there are many uncertainties in the areas of modern slavery and human trafficking. And because it's so opaque, it makes it difficult to address directly. So of course, there are systemic and complex issues, but we can address them collaboratively. Like, we can definitely have an impact. So whatever your role, position, and experience, there is a global community of people trying to make things right, and we need your talents. So there is something you can do. And you've already taken a major step today by joining this discussion, and we strongly encourage you to keep walking down that virtuous path. We are happy to share more resources and to answer your questions if you have any.
Yeah, so just to summarize really quickly, the way you can think about the problem is three-pronged. It's supply, demand, and policy. So as consumers, we're part of demand. Supply, people like Nathan and professionals that are working in the industry. And then if there are any people that work on the policy side, with laws, that is really the way that we can force and enforce change. So thank you all so much, very sincerely, for being here and joining us today. And I'd like to open up the conversation to a Q&A. Nathan, if you wanted to go ahead and finish your thought, and then we can put questions either into the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and speak to the group.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. You could hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the previous thought about quickly, if you were buying any apparel here in the U.S. with any sort of cotton in it, especially from China, we know that about 90% of that cotton comes from the Xinjiang Northwest region of China. But we also have to remember that we have supply chains around the world that use China cotton. They actually import China cotton. We manufacture a lot in Bangladesh and Cambodia and Vietnam, and that cotton still comes from China, and probably 90% of it from the Xinjiang province. So it's important as a company to really develop a supply chain transparency system and program. And just the other point about, you asked about who are some of the leaders. And I listed a couple only because I'm in this industry. And although they're not perfect, I can tell you the Patagonias and the REIs and the Columbias, Nikes and Adidas, as much as they're in the news at times for negative things, they really are the leaders in our industry and have really helped push the global supply chain in really positive directions because they have the leverage in the supply chain. If my company makes up 2% of the manufacturing in a factory, but Nike and Under Armour and all these other great companies are in there and they make up 80 or 90%, I'm happy to be in that factory because I know of all the good work that they're doing. So I know it's easy to talk negative about some of those larger companies, but over the last 25 years, they've actually been the leaders. So don't shy away from those brands. They are really doing really well in environmental, especially in human trafficking and the modern slavery world. They really are leaders. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
No, that's a great point. I think the scale that certain brands have is part of the core issue because we have to produce so much, right? Those brands produce a lot, but it also gives them leverage to make quick change, right? So it could be seen as a positive or a negative. We just hope that a lot of these brands will use their scale to affect change quickly and generally. So anybody else want to just go ahead and unmute yourself? I can't see anyone.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Holden. I go to college. I'm a senior at Boston University, and I took a class on human rights. So I guess for me, my question is, do you think that it just because human sex trafficking and just like slavery and all that has just become maybe a little too like normalized in a bad way, obviously, like in so many countries, like I was learning about like South Sudan and many areas there, it's just become very normalized to have such a huge percent of women or children or anyone grow up in such an adult place for such a young age of being used for sex trafficking and slavery and all those type of things.
Marie, would you like to take that question?
I'm not too sure. Sorry.
So Holden, do you mind rephrasing your main question?
Please.
Yeah, so I was just, because of what I've learned of my studies, how this type of sex trafficking and slavery has become somewhat normalized in many terrible places in the world. Is that a reason or why there's so many causes and effects of why this is still maybe happening today? Because in so many poor places all around the world, this is looked as a normal life for so many young people.
Yeah, I think I definitely think there's a normalization and people are kind of desensitized from it. What we were hoping to do with this discussion today was actually have a conversation with someone who was a victim of the system. Unfortunately, we didn't really want to do like a show and tell, and we don't want people to relive their trauma for the sake of our consumption. But it is really important, as you mentioned, to kind of manifest and incarnate this issue. We need faces and names and stories, and we tried to illustrate a little bit of that to you today. But 1 in 188 people is a victim of modern slavery. And Dunbar's number is like 150 people. We have social networks. We can maintain social networks of around 150 people. So we should theoretically all know someone. We don't necessarily get that interaction. So a lot of this is done on kind of theoretical, academic, kind of like not in a human, personal way. And I think that that is also part of the problem of becoming kind of not desensitized or normalized, but it's just like we don't necessarily get that human connection. So we may not see the problem, but hopefully it will become easier for us to see these issues. And there are people that have gotten out of these systems that you can listen to, and that's one of our main actions for people to take, is to listen to those victims and to have a face so that there can be more human emotion and empathy behind our actions.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hear your point, Holden, about normalization. I think it's always linked to so many more issues. Well, for instance, in really poor villages in India, you have traffickers that just come there and tell the parents they would earn so much if they give away their children, basically. And the main leverage here is really poverty, and there is also a caste issue. But it's not just this, there's also a culture, there's also pressure to make cheap. And this is the main driver that really gets everything, every cultural, every legal leverage down to below zero, actually. So it's a very complex issue. Yeah, maybe Manoj, you want to complement this?
It's India. There are some traditional based sex trafficking also, where the family believes if they are a girl child do for the earning, it will be blessing them for the God. So when the child birth in their community, girl child especially, they have the big ceremonies. How we celebrate the other ceremonies. So they are very happy when the girl child birth in their community. There are the 4-5 communities in India. They have the sex trafficking in their tradition. Apart from the sex trafficking, the girl child never allowed to do any other job, businesses. Even they can't educate them. So the girl child also believe, okay, it is my profession. I have to do for me and for my family. So if you go my LinkedIn, that I have described about that community, how that they function and how they operate. So this booming this pedophile buyer demands for the male child, and the age will be the male child 8 to 14 years. And most of the pedophiles who are the buyer, they are the foreign national who came here as a tourist, and they lure the street children, and they target the poverty community who is very poor. So this is they have the strategy. So we have to understand how modern slavery carrying on.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
Manoj made a comment in the chat about it being a 0% investment and 100% profit. So what better margins can you get than that, right? So if we're looking strictly for capitalist solutions, there you go. But I know that Selena had a question, so I'd like to invite her to ask.
Yeah, hello, I'm Selena. I'm a sophomore at Harvard right now. And my question was more about how we see a kind of trend right now where us consumers are also becoming producers, or like what we could think of as micro brands, with this upsurge of merch and streetwear with logos becoming ever more so popular. And companies like Printful and whatnot make it really easy for an individual to produce merchandise and apparel at the small level. And just like in my own experience of researching on producers and suppliers, it's really difficult as an individual in the space to find people who ethically source their fabric for you to print on. And considering this, with this upsurge in merchandise, how are ways that people who are seeking to enter this kind of print-on-demand space, how can they do so in an ethical manner? And then also, as this is becoming more of a trend, how can we, if this is essentially harmful and it's really difficult to mitigate the harmful effects from this, how can we dissuade people from moving towards this trend of just buy something, put your logo on it, and ship it out?
Did you want to speak to this, Marie, or I'll take it if...
It's really easy to be tempted by I print my logo on something and it gets shipped, and well, I'm told it's a sustainable t-shirt or bag and that's it. I do have some good resources I could share. I could probably send them via email. But I also think it's really important to build your own business. If you can't find out there what you need to, well, you can maybe start up your business and get something that's really sustainable to the core. I mean, it's easy to say I'm really aware of this, but I think it's something that's really been enabled lately in the US, and it's in Europe as well. So I strongly encourage entrepreneurship, sustainable entrepreneurship.
Yeah, absolutely. So Selena, part of my thesis at Harvard was talking about the diversification of not only demand, but also supply. So instead of having, the homogenization or kind of oligarchical control of the fashion industry, it's really dominated by New York, Paris, Milan, London, instead of having, and Tokyo, right? Instead of having everything becoming more centralized and homogenous, I do think that we need like a lot of diversity in terms of our production and supply. So we have smaller manufacturers that create products that resonate more with an individual consumer, because we are, as a global consumer base, we're incredibly diverse. So not everyone should be, can you imagine a world where there's only one brand, right? So I kind of want to create the opposite of that world. So, the people kind of moving towards becoming their own brand and even producing their own products can be positive, but if it's done kind of in this expeditious sort of thoughtless way where it's just like, I just need products to sell, like what I think happens a lot with YouTube merch. As Nathan pointed out, 90% of the cotton comes from Xinjiang. And so you have anything cotton, a lot of the environmental movement is like, we need to have natural fibers, right? But I would prefer my natural fibers without the genocide. But we're all falling victim to this as consumers. So as consumers kind of become producers, as long as we're having these conversations and people are aware of these ethical issues, I hope that people will start to make more correct decisions. But I think you also pointed out the need for centralized production for smaller independent creators that's completely ethical. And I don't know of any resources. I think Marie said that she would share some with you, but I actually don't know of any such manufacturer.
Timothy, I wanted to add that one characteristic of the luxury brand industry is that there are very few on-the-ground, country-specific actual offices. A lot of the offices are held in Milan, Hong Kong, Paris, where the supply chain is not. And I know in my industry, we ship to the mass merchants, and in the countries we source from, we have offices in those countries, whether it's Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, wherever. But in the luxury brand, it really is a gap in their sourcing and in the way that they can truly find out their supply chain. And I think I would love to see the luxury brand industry start to have boots on the ground in some of the sourcing countries they're in. And I think that's really a gap that they currently have. So I think that's a trend that they need to respect and get more involved in. A lot of the luxury brands work through their buying houses in Hong Kong, as you know. And these are just buying houses. They're not in the individual countries where products are made. So I'm just identifying a gap in the difference between the luxury brand industry and sort of some of the apparel licensed products that I deal with for mass merchants and mid-tier type of companies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. I also was like thinking of producing some things, but I want to do it in an ethical and responsible way. So Selena, thank you so much for your question. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, just regarding, oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
Sure. So my name's Debbie Paul. I'm a Harvard College and Harvard Law School alum. And I have a question about law enforcement. I mean, if we take the example of Los Angeles that was discussed earlier in the hour, I've got to think that a lot of what was going on was illegal. And so I have a question, why aren't the authorities cracking down on that? Is it that they don't know or they don't care? Or what? And then second, and sort of relatedly as a strategy, is it not a strategy to inform them and make a point about these conditions being illegal? And obviously that would address it domestically, and that's only a part of the problem. But of course, some of these practices may be illegal in foreign countries as well.
It is a very good point. It is a very good question. Well, so I'd say a bit of both. They do care, obviously, and they are trying to solve these issues. But the thing with law enforcement is that when you enforce law, factories and businesses are likely to go underground and to hide away. And which means usually people would be even more precarious, they would be even more exploited, and they would work in dreadful conditions. So, and also because it's not just easy to identify businesses, but it could be in-houses work, or it can be women taking some pieces and working at home, stitching the products. It's not so easy to identify and to take measures to prevent, to punish this.
I think Sharon also said that that it gets harder to enforce legally the further up the supply chain, or the further back you go in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe just, if I may, a follow-up. I mean, these issues have been going on for well over 100 years. And the unions kind of helped.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that's, here in this country, but that's a transnational kind of movement. Is why don't you see more unionization? Or do you actually? I know you do in Bangladesh, but I don't know elsewhere.
So if we're talking about even just unionization in the US, like that's something my grandpa worked very passionately on. And, even companies of very empowered workers with an empowered workforce, like Amazon, it's incredibly difficult for them to unionize and organize, and they are also threatened with losing their job and their livelihood. And I think especially in a global pandemic, that's very precarious. And also the fact that our healthcare is tied to our employment. A lot of people that are maybe undocumented aren't even receiving such benefits. But I think there's a general trend in the US, I can't necessarily speak to other countries, of, companies and corporations amassing unprecedented amounts of capital and power, and workers really being disenfranchised. And so I don't think it's the workers themselves that can necessarily make these movements. And also brands, if it's way back in like the dyeing process for a product or the harvesting process, they may not be that aware. I do think that blockchain again will increase the transparency, but you probably know more about the legal aspect to it than I do.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah, well, did we have, did we answer your question? I'm sorry if that was like a non-answer.
No, I mean, I don't know that there are any good answers to these.
Do we have any other questions from the group?
I see Jennifer's hand up.
Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. Just Deborah, in response to what you said. So I'm a lawyer from the US and have been living in Europe for the last 5 years, and I'm in Lesbos right now. And when you talk about, you know, why is this happening? How can this be happening in my country? Is it a resource issue? Why isn't somebody going in and enforcing the law? That's one way to look at it. But the other way to look at it is, what's driving all of this? What are the root causes that has created this? And I think that's really where our focus and energies, and I don't mean to be insensitive to the people who are being exploited right now, but I think that really should be where our energies are and our focus should be. If you guys want to read somebody who I've never met before, but I totally admire, her name's Genevieve LeBaron, and she wrote Addressing the Root Causes of Modern Slavery. And it goes right into what is the basis for all of this? Why is it happening? And it really is supply and demand. And, you know, we all want to distance ourselves from any moral culpability for our role in this. But we are part of the demand. And understanding how that's working, I think, is really fundamentally an important step in appreciating what is going on in the world right now. So I just wanted to speak that. I mean, there's so many ways you can look at this issue as to why is this happening? And the moral outrage is the first step. And it's a good step, and we should have it, and we should be morally outraged. But there's a lot beneath it. And the answer is we're all responsible. And so I would just recommend, you know, if you want to learn more, I do think there's laws that need to be implemented to hold the people with the power. Right now it's the big brands, and I'm not trying to victimize any brands at all whatsoever. They're doing the best they can. But there needs to be more accountability. And in order to move anything forward, we all have to understand that this isn't a law enforcement issue.
Yeah, I think law enforcement can definitely help. I would agree with everything you said, except for maybe big brands are doing the best they can. I think some of them are, absolutely, but I don't think all of them are, because as you said, the root cause to me is unbridled capitalism. And as Manoj pointed out, it's 0% cost and 100% profit, which is absolutely insane to me. Do we have any other questions? So if we don't have any other questions, I did want to go back to Marie and ask a couple of more questions about your organization. So you will be, you guys are a new organization and you're going to be incorporating in the US as well, is that correct?
Yes, we will. So stay tuned.
And the reason why you're incorporating is so that you can have people on the ground where it's actually happening. Is that accurate?
Yes, and also, as Jennifer just mentioned, we also want to raise awareness and to show people that they are the demand, that they can change. And because, well, the US, as we said, is consuming goods, garment goods, then we also have a responsibility here.
Yeah, and I think also this point about not consuming, when I was trying to get dressed for this event, I was thinking, what item of clothing in my wardrobe do I know for a fact is not made with modern slave labor or any sort of exploitation? And we can all kind of do this exercise. I think it's almost impossible to identify anything. I believe that this brand that I'm wearing, Palomo from Spain, is the production is done in-house, and it is a lot of handmade work from high skilled craftsmen, which a lot of people that are exploited are also. So I believe that it's not, but you know, it is cotton. So I can't even say, you know, something that I kind of invested in, a piece that I invested in isn't necessarily free from that. I think also, to Nathan's point, I wanted to mention that having people on the ground in those countries where the supply chains exist and a lot of the victimization happens is a really wonderful idea and important for brands to implement, because that will also help to economically empower people in those countries. We can see what kind of some of the wages are like $2.80 in Indonesia per day. And so being able to economically empower people to do something good is incredibly important, and something that our system needs to create. Does anybody have any other questions?
I had a quick follow-up question, just inspired kind of what you just said. Fashion is really known for like its high margins, like the fact that that it's made for like pennies, honestly, and it can be upmarked and sold at 1,000% off price. Do you think if, as consumers, we could like encourage a culture of paying more, like move away from the concept of being able to pay $20 for a dress and have it be a real dress, and move towards like maybe pay $40, but you're guaranteed that it is made by people? Do you think that's like a culture that we could encourage, and how would we move towards encouraging that type of culture?
So I would say, in my idealized system that I have in my head, people would be investing in their clothes, and we actually used to invest heavily in our clothing, in our material culture. Technological advances like the jacquard loom made patterns and jacquards very democratic and accessible at a price point. So there is this argument of like, let's make fashion democratic. This is not democracy, right? This is not, you know, it's some people saving money in certain areas, so they're spending it in other areas. I do advocate for a consumer cultural shift of investing more in fewer pieces. There are also alternative models like renting. You know, if you have that psychological or social need to change constantly, there are other business models which will enable you to do that we already see. But I do think that there's a strong case for an emotional attachment to our clothing, which allows us to value it more highly. And that's really what we're getting to. But as Marie pointed out, the price isn't always a good indicator of it being, you know, free of modern slavery and human trafficking.
And also a fair price for a dress would be more something like $350, so $350, which is, well, yes, this is not democracy, but at the same time, it's not democracy to sell products this expensive. I mean, it is a fair price, but we have to acknowledge that everyone can't afford a dress worth $300 or more.
And that, yeah, that's incredibly, some people see that as incredibly expensive. Other people see it as like not so expensive. Why do some people see this? Some people could see it as like something they don't even think about, right? Like Jeff Bezos has made $70 billion this year. Elon Musk has made like 130, 140. To them, buying like a $350 suit or a $2,000 suit, a $5,000 suit means nothing. Are they spending their money in that way? Not necessarily, because to them, it doesn't mean anything, right? Money has essentially, the utility of an extra dollar has actually become pretty much $0 for them. we don't, so to go back to Jennifer's point of addressing like root causes, so why can't people afford a $350 dress? There's a root cause to that because we have unfair economic development, and especially for the Black community, you know, being put 400 years behind, and communities of color, immigrants, women, any sort of marginalized community has been economically disadvantaged so that other people will become more economically empowered. And so that's really the root cause. If we could economically empower all individuals, I'm not talking about communism, but maybe capitalism with a floor or with some more guardrails, or a compromise of the two systems. I think we can economically empower everyone to the point where they can afford a $350 dress, and that reverberates throughout the supply chain and empowers everyone that worked on it.
And again, you can rent and borrow and reuse and keep using the same garments for decades.
So when my grandma passed away, she had an amazing wardrobe, and I actually have a lot of pieces from her. And that clothing not only has like a new life and a new utility with me, but it also has more meaning and more value to me. And so that's really important, that people value what they buy. And so the price is an indicator of how much something is, like what the value of something is, but there's also intangible values, you know, the memories that you have associated with a certain piece, or how it's become, you know, a part of your life and a part of your personal story and narrative. So any other, Tim Jackson, I see you're making a lot of comments. I'm so sorry I'm not able to keep up with all the comments in the chat, but if Tim or anybody else that has shared a comment wanted to bring up something, I know we didn't touch on everything, but we have about 5 minutes left. Hi, Tim.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for this event. I mean, it's been really absorbing for me. I've made a few observations throughout the evening. I think one of the things I do is I've been covering luxury business conferences since 2005 globally, and I've seen sort of shifts in emphasis and narratives. So that was the basis of the Antoine Arnaud comment that I put up earlier. But the basic point that I've seen it emerge is there's going to be a reluctance amongst the younger generation, what we would call the Gen Zs, and maybe sort of slightly the lower age Gen Ys, in over consuming things. You know, you first kind of noticed it when CDs disappeared, digital fashion. And almost everything that they consume is in some kind of digital, non-physical format. I'm of an age, and you know, where I remember in the UK in particular, going and buying clothing from boutiques. You know, little kind of one-off shops that would service local designers, or you know, have a network throughout the UK that you might get in London, something that was designed in Leicester or whatever. But it was that. And you know, you go back to capitalism, it was that consumer boom driven by a very clear political ideology to create a sort of private wealth that encouraged the sort of mass availability of, you know, through brands like Next, if you've ever heard of them, and Principles, and it was self-perpetuating. So you've got a generation of demand for things that people don't really need, and you see people's wardrobes expanding, and maybe 10-20% of them being used. So my point being is that it's not an inevitability. We have to continue with that. Life existed perfectly well when I was growing up, where you would make that investment piece. You would buy something that was really good quality, because that was the quality. It wasn't a question of bad quality. And I'm shuddering at the latest news that Uyghur, which is a brand that I started off when I was at university working in, is now being bought by M&S. You know, that may not mean a lot to you guys, but Uyghur had factories in Alloa in Scotland, the really beautiful wool cashmere. You know, the idea of you know, toxins and pesticides and excess water usage and all this was just not so much around at that time. And yet we've seen Marks and Spencer's as a retailer brand in UK being criticised for a drop in quality. And you know whether or not there's empirical evidence of that, I think your average consumer will look at a pair of socks and say they don't last the same as they used to. So I'm kind of my intuition is that the younger consumers won't put up with it, and that there is a kind of acknowledgement that people are going to be buying fewer things. And so you might as well create wonderful things that are better made, that are have if you like a blockchain transparency code that you can scan your phone over so that you understand the provenance of it. And I can see that that's very much the move towards the brands. And the last point I would make is this idea of revenue streams coming from multiple sources, not just new products. I think brands have got to get over this idea that something has to be new to generate revenue. So Patagonia is probably the best example of the repurpose, remake, repair, and rental. And I think the sooner they get their heads around this, the better.
I agree with so many of your points, but I wanted to ask Selena or any other Gen Zer, because I'm a millennial, if they have an opinion on this.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit biased on this point because for me, I've been really into fashion design from a young age. And when I learned that, like to your point, Timothy, if I look in my closet and I can't guarantee that somebody was not exploited to make this, that was really painful for me. So I started making a lot of my clothes and moving towards more purchasing thrifted or pre-owned or going into my mother's closet and trying to find things. But I think it's definitely going to be an uphill battle just because as my generation and like those growing up now have been increasingly accustomed to instant purchase, instant demand, a need to make everything new and to update that newness and make it apparent that they have these new purchases, it's definitely going to be a challenge. But I think with that, our generation is also obviously very impassioned and they have a sense of a desire to like improve the world. So I think if we can package both what like Tim was talking about, quality with the sense that people should be responsible, I think that will be really successful.
Yeah, I think, I think all consumers can wake up to this, but I think Gen Z is uniquely positioned. A lot of them have grown up, if you're in the US and you were born after the year 2000, the US has been at war your entire lifetime, right? And so there's a very different sensibility, I think, when it comes to consumerism. And I see a lot of movement around political engagement and the environmental movement. And I think something that I learned is that, that we have these intersectional issues, but maybe the solutions can also be intersectional and they have reverberations throughout the supply chain and these systems that we currently have in place to create more solutions, which will really empower everyone. I don't know if I'm an idealist or too naive, but I'm really encouraged by each and every one of you that has been here today. And thank you so much to everyone for sharing. Marie, did you want to say any final?
Yes, well, I agree with you. There is raising awareness on these issues, and now it's time to take action.
Yep, absolutely. So thank you all for taking this extra step in this path with us, where this is just the beginning for us and we'll stay committed to this issue. So please do. I'm gonna put my email in the chat so anyone can reach out to me. Marie, if you wanted to do that as well. Or anybody that got the invite should also have my email as well. And please do feel free to email me, add me on LinkedIn, and I hope that we can take, individual as well as collective action to address these issues. So thank you so much, everyone.
I have a question.
Thank you very much.